Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. With this video, I want to start a new series on Australian Lutheran Synods. And particularly in this series, I want to go through the different Lutheran Synods currently in Australia and what are the theological differences. And so I do have a chart that I've done up, which is on the Order of Knight George website, www.knightgeorge.info, though there has been some dead links and some errors and stuff with the site. I am looking at just retconning the whole thing and just starting a brand new website. Stay tuned for that. I don't know. You'll see when it happens. But I did do a chart ump, and the chart goes through some of the major differences between the different synods. Now, if you would like to know the different synods' views on other theological points, I could look into that. It's sometimes hard because not every synod has statements on everything. But this chart is based on either official statements or, particularly with the more minor synods, speaking with them directly to get them to give their answers. So for example, there's the new synod that just formed in Australia, the Lutheran Mission Australia, and they haven't really got statements on everything yet, but I did send the chart to their president, Matt Anker, and got him to fill in the chart for me. So when we get to discussing the positions of the LMA, just know that those have come from the president himself. Now, like I said, if you watching this series would like me to go into other areas, like, oh, what are their views on things like justification, or what are their views on abortion, or this, that, or whatever, I can do some research into that, and I can add those points in later. But I'm going to begin this series by just mainly going through the chief points of difference, and by that I mean these are the points that are most notably where the groups disagree. And so as a teaser for the rest of this series, the main points of interest we're going to discuss is communion fellowship, the women serving in the church, women's suffrage, lay consecration, lay distribution, and lay preaching. Because we couldn't just say lay ministry, because different synods have differing degrees of what they allow and don't allow in regards to lay ministry. There's also the question of online communion, because that has been a point of contention in Australia. There's also the argument over the consumption of the reliquia, because that again has also been a point of contention amongst different Lutheran churches in Australia. I'm going to mention the issue of head coverings, not because it's been necessarily a point of contention amongst all the synods of Australia, but it was earlier on, and there is a particular synod that makes a big deal out of it, so that is a point of divergence. There's also the issue of Pentecostalism, which churches embrace it, allow it, don't allow it. And then lastly, private prayer fellowship, because again, this has been an issue of division between different synods. And what's interesting is that it's not really just like high church versus low church, conservative versus liberal. When it comes to something like private prayer fellowship, it's kind of all over the shop, which churches allow it and which don't. But we'll get to that when we get to that episode. This episode is not actually going to be going through any theological point. This is where I'd like to give a brief history of the Lutheran synods in Australia. Now, I want to specify that when I say this, I'm mainly talking about just the English-speaking Lutheran synods in Australia. And people say, oh, why? Why can't you talk about the non-English-speaking synods? The main reason is there is no such thing as a non-English-speaking synod in Australia. There are non-English speaking Lutheran churches in Australia, whether they're Slovak, Latvian, Danish, German, but they're not really their own synods. Those congregations actually belong to overseas churches. So like the German churches in Australia, they are considered members of the state church in Germany. Same goes for the Danish church and the Latvian churches and the Slovak church and all those in Australia. They actually belong to synods in other countries. So really, they're more missions of overseas synods. They're not a standalone Australian Lutheran synod. All the other ones we're going to cover are more Australian-based Lutheran synods. I mean, with the exception of, like, you've got the LCMC here in Australia, and also my own church, the COELC. We have congregations based in Australia. We also have congregations based in other countries. But the congregations in Australia are Australian congregations, not just like missions supported by overseas churches. And so the Danish Lutheran churches, the German Lutheran churches, and the Latvian Lutheran churches in Australia, they're not their own separate synods. So, like, for example, in America, they used to have, in the old days, there was something like the Norwegian Lutheran Synod. It wasn't run by the Norwegian Lutheran Church over in Norway. It was its own standalone American synod. It just only spoke Norwegian. So we don't really have something like that in Australia. All the churches in Australia that don't speak English are just kind of church missions and plants of overseas churches. They're not their own standalone synods. There is no Australian German Lutheran Synod. If there was, I would cover it. So, for example, over in Denmark, the Danish Lutheran Church over there did actually become its own little separate micro-synod. It's not run by the Danish church over in Denmark. So that would get a mention if we had something similar like that here in Australia, but at this point in time, we do not. So really just going to focus on the Lutheran synods in Australia. And so to start off, we're going to start with the first synod, which is the largest synod, and that's the Lutheran Church of Australia, the LCA. Now, the LCA was formed back in 1966 from a merger of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, which was basically like the Missouri Synod in Australia, and the what was then called the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia, or UELCA, which was a member of the Lutheran World Federation, but it's not like the modern ELCA. It wasn't that liberal. It's more like, kind of like the what was back then the ALC. They actually kind of did have unofficial fellowship between the ALC and the UELCA in Australia. Based on how everything's kind of moved further liberal these days, the UELCA would probably be nearly on par with the modern day LCMS, because things have drifted. Like, the old ELCA was a Missouri Synod in Australia, but there's a difference between like the old Missouri and the current Missouri, which is going to come up in conversations while we're discussing this. But the very first synod that is not the LCA that split off was the ELCR. Now, just to point out, the LCA is really the only major synod in Australia. Now, Lutheranism in Australia is not very big. According to the Australian Lutheran census, we're like 0.5 or 0.7 something of a percent. With not even 1% of Australians are Lutherans. And a lot of people who fill out the census aren't even church-going members. They're people that attend the Lutheran private schools. And so they may never actually go to church and may never actually become an official member of a Lutheran church, but they will tick off the census as a Lutheran. And so the amount of Lutherans in Australia is pretty small. I think the LCA used to be roughly around about 70,000 members, just to put into perspective, like, the size we're looking at. And that's the biggest Lutheran synod in Australia. I believe it is now called the Lutheran Church of Australia and New Zealand, because they have congregations in New Zealand. For the longest time, it was just the LCA with the New Zealand district, but I do believe they have now officially changed the name to LCA NZ. So I might refer to them as LCA throughout this series, just for the sake of ease, because that is what they have been called for the longest time. But I do believe their name is officially now LCA NZ, and they are the biggest church. The second kind of biggest synod at this point, I would say, is the AELC, which we'll get to later. And the third biggest is the ELCR, although the new LMA synod is going to give both of those kind of a run for their money, but only time will tell how big that new synod's going to be. The current third biggest synod in Australia is the ELCR. This was the first group to ever break off. Technically, the ELCR actually predates the LCA, because it actually formed into a new synod before the official start date of the LCA. So the ELCR, how it got formed, is that prior to the union between the ELCA and the UELCA, there was a bunch of pastors, probably about 15, who were protesting it. There was even this big protest from the Queensland district of the ELCA saying we don't want a union, and they even threatened to have the whole district break off and form its own synod. However, when push came to shove and the new synod got formed, that didn't happen. A few handfuls of people and congregations left, and they were led by a single pastor who broke off, Frederick Kleinig, and they formed what was then called the ELCR, the Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation. And to begin with, they first entered into fellowship with the Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation over in America, the LCR, which was a group that broke off from Missouri back in the 1920s or something. And so the ELCR and the LCR were in fellowship. And this leads to the formation of the next church body we're going to talk about, which is today called the ELSA, but they've got a bit of a kind of a complicated history. So what happened is that after the ELCR got formed, Pastor Frederick Kleinig was actually an old retired pastor. He'd already retired in the LCR. He came out of retirement to start the ELCR. So he was old and he wanted a new younger pastor to help take over things. And so the LCR in America sent over Pastor Hunter, but Pastor Kleinig and Pastor Hunter got into a big fight over head coverings. Pastor Kleinig made it a mandate saying that women had to cover their heads in church and that they couldn't have communion if they didn't cover their heads. Pastor Hunter took a more kind of an adiaphora, advisable but not necessary view on head coverings, and that led to the split. So this happened back in 1971, where the Faith Lutheran Parish split from the ELCR and was just its own Lutheran church. You also then get later in 1973, there is a member from a Wells-affiliated congregation over in America. So it wasn't actually a Wells congregation, it was a Wells-affiliated congregation in America, and one of their members came over to Australia to teach in a university in Adelaide. But because he was Wells-affiliated, he didn't want to have fellowship with the LCA. So him and his wife basically started a home church, and from there they managed to get some other people to join them. Some other little house churches popped up, and they became the Grace Lutheran Church. And what happened then is that the Faith group in Queensland and the Grace group in South Australia began to chat with each other. Pastor Hunter at this point had already gone back to America, and so the Faith group reached out to the Grace group and said, hey, maybe we could work together. And so in 1989, the Queensland group officially registers themselves as the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, also known as the ELSA. And then in 1991, the South Australian Grace group officially joins them as their South Australian members. So looking at 89, 91 is the formation of this new group, the ELSA. Now, the thing about the ELCR and the ELSA, though, is that the ELCR has managed to hold pretty steady with its members. It hasn't really grown much since formation, but also hasn't really shrunk much. It's kind of stayed pretty level with its member congregations, having about, I think, 5, 6 congregations at the moment, and currently 3 pastors. The ELSA group, however, did not. They had a bigger group and a bigger influence in Queensland and South Australia to begin with. After time, some of those congregations just disappeared. Some of the congregations would go on to actually join the later forming AELC. But the ELSA basically today exists only as a congregation in Maryborough, and there's also a congregation down in Brisbane which is in fellowship with them, but is not actually a part of their synod. The congregation in Brisbane used to be part of the synod, but for some reason left the synod but retained altar pulpit fellowship. And the ELSA, because of its then affiliation with the Wells back in its founding, still today is in fellowship with the Wells and Els in America. So when I talk about the ELSA, basically consider them to be the Wisconsin Synod in Australia. Now another synod that broke away, which still exists today, though is very small, kind of a couple families and little few house churches around. They don't have a pastorate now, and they are very hard to get in contact, so exact numbers on them is hard to calculate, but they are the OELC, or Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Church. They were formed by a pastor, Audley Grieger. So what happened is Audley Grieger used to be a lay missionary in the LCA, or originally in the ELCA, then in the new LCA. He didn't like the new LCA, so he went and joined the ELCR. But just like Pastor Hunter and Pastor Kleinig had a falling out, so did Pastor Audley Grieger and Pastor Kleinig, and so Pastor Audley Grieger went off and formed his own group, the OELC, and basically he looked after them until his death in the 2010s. Since then they haven't had a new pastor, and like I said, they're very hard to get into contact with, so I don't really have much details on how many members they still have to this day. The next big synod that we talk about is the current second biggest synod in Australia, the AELC, Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church. Now their history is again a little bit complicated. Basically they were founded by three pastors, Vernon Grieger, his twin brother Melvin Grieger, and a pastor Clarence Prebino. Now these three pastors had originally been pastors of the ELCA and had protested the union and had threatened to not join the union if the union happened. However, when push came to shove, they went along and joined the LCA. And for like the next 30 years, they basically just complained and fought until eventually they left. Now the exact details of that I could go into, but I'm not... This video is already going to be like nearly 20 minutes and I'm not even halfway through the history. So this is going to be a long video, and so I'm going to try and cut this history down as much as possible. Basically, there was a lot of fights, a lot of issues. They had issues over inerrancy, evolution, women in the church, the opening up of the communion fellowship in the LCA, and a number of issues, and they left and they formed the AELC in 1993. There was other pastors that came along as well. They got joined by other groups, and they actually got rather big at one stage until they had their own split, which we will get to in a moment. But we're at this point in time moving chronologically along. So the next group that I'm going to mention is a... I don't know, I really don't know if we should consider this group Lutheran, but they are a group that had Lutheran origins. So this is the Living Waters Community Church that got founded back in 1993 in Mildura. So this was founded by a Pentecostal group in Mildura that split off from the Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, and so they formed the Living Waters Community Church. Now they probably see themselves less as Lutheran and more as like non-denominational Pentecostal, but they are a church that have Lutheran origins. They were founded by Pentecostal Lutherans. So even though they may not even identify as Lutheran today, they had Lutheran roots, and that's why I still bother to include them in this list. Moving along though, this is where we now get the split in the AELC. So basically, long story short, Pastor Melvin died. There was congregations that didn't have a pastor. The AELC was temporarily practicing lay consecration. That is where a lay person is to speak the words of institution. This then basically blew up into a big fight in the AELC. Some people supported it, some people didn't. As I said, there were basically three founding pastors of the AELC: Melvin Grieger, Vernon Grieger, and Clarence Prebino. Melvin had passed away, and this issue really became a fight between Vernon Grieger and Clarence Prebino. One, Prebino, said lay consecration was wrong. The other, Pastor Grieger, said lay consecration was fine. And really, just to make the whole thing short, congregations and pastors fell on one side versus the other side, and that led to a split. Now, if you ask either side, some will say they were kicked out, some will say they left. History is messy and difficult, and everybody's going to basically tell the story that puts them in the best light and the other side in the worst light. Basically, the church split over lay consecration. What is interesting, and this becomes really hard, the lay consecrationists group never formed an official new synod. Now, the pastors that were part of the lay consecrationists, they have kept altar pulpit fellowship with themselves, and so they're kind of like an unofficial synod, which is why I like to put them all together as one big group, but they are all independent congregations. They never formed a new synod, which is why I refer to them as the independents. So they are independent congregations, but they are all in fellowship with each other. So they're kind of like a pseudo-synod, in that way, an unofficial synod, so I will clump them together as a synod. And this then leads now to the next split to take place, and that is one of the congregations that had formerly been AELC, which was now part of these independent congregations. They started practicing selective fellowship. Well, all those independent congregations started to practice selective fellowship. And there was a particular family in that congregation that didn't want to practice selective fellowship. They wanted to practice closed communion. This was the Stiller family. So the Stiller family left these independent congregations because they wanted to retain closed communion. However, they didn't want to go back to the AELC because they still wanted to have lay consecration. Now this happened in 2010. 2 years later, they would reach out and join the Church of the Lutheran Confessions based in America, the CLC. So that's how those congregation gets formed in 2012. Now, there's another group that pops up in 2012, and this is the Living Water Fellowship congregation in Wagga Wagga. So they were members of the Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Wagga Wagga, but they split off, founded a new congregation, and they joined up with the Lutheran Churches in Mission for Christ, the LCMC, located again in America. So again, so if you're really wanting to associate congregations with stuff, the LCA is kind of, it doesn't really have fellowship with anyone, so it's its own thing. The ELCR is standalone. The OELC is its own thing. The ELSA is basically Wisconsin in Australia. The AELC, it's kind of like an old Missouri style synod. So in America, there are those old Missouri breakaway synods that like to be more kind of like early 1900s or 1950s Missouri, and that's what the AELC kind of is. The independents, and they're kind of, again, their own little thing. The Stiller family are members of the CLC, and the Wagga Wagga congregation are members of the LCMC. So for those in America who watch my videos, this will kind of help you understand who a few of these congregations are. And moving along, we then get, in 2014, there's the Redeemer Christian Fellowship congregation that pops up. And this is started by a pastor, Troy Harris, and there's some other families and people that form this congregation with him. And they are an independent congregation, but they're not members of the independents because they're not in fellowship with them. They were originally connected with the International Lutheran Diocese, but they later left them for, theological disagreements, and they changed their name from Redeemer Christian Fellowship later to the St. Jude the Apostle Evangelical Lutheran Church. They're located down in Melbourne, and I forget what year exactly, but more recently they've entered into fellowship with some micro-synods over in Sweden, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden, and the Concordia Lutheran Church, which is located in Sweden. So they're members of that synod. It is interesting, they are very similar in theology to my own synod, the coelc. There are some minor differences which we will discuss in our future videos. But continuing on now with our history, the next two congregations to pop up are the Growth Lutheran Network, started by Pastor Michael Parker. That was originally started over in Western Australia. Now, I'm not exactly sure of the details as to why that church got started. Something to do with mission stuff. Pastor Parker, while he is considered probably a conservative confessional Lutheran, he is much more missional minded, like a missionalist in his theology. And he left the LCA for whatever reason. He was also joined by another pastor from the Latvian Lutheran Church over in Western Australia, and they also had a pastoral student as well, and they were originally looking after like 3 house churches. That's back in 2015 when they got founded. Over the last 10 years, that synod has really fallen apart, and as far as I know today, it's basically just Pastor Parker and a few members, and they're now located in Adelaide, because he was living at Perth when the synod got founded. He later moved to Adelaide, and it was kind of after he moved away that the group in Perth really fell apart. A typical situation where when a synod gets founded by a particular individual, that individual is the glue that holds things together, and if they're not there, things don't really work without them. So as far as I know today, it's kind of just Pastor Parker in South Australia with a few members. Again, I don't know the exact details as to how big his congregation is, but that's the Growth Lutheran Network. You also have another group that gets founded, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church. This is an online church community started by Pastor Chris Roseborough of the Association of American Lutheran Churches, or AALC over in America, and he had some members here in Australia. There was also Pastor Joel Klein, who used to be of the LCA, who was affiliated with that. Later, Pastor Joel Klein left the LCA and basically took over the whole Australian and the rest of the whole Aletheia mission. They were kind of a mission of Pastor Chris Roseborough to begin with, but they later then became their own separate entity. Today, they are known as Allies, the Aletheia Lutheran International Evangelical Synod. That was more like recently, like in 2020 or 2021. Recently, in like the 2020s, that they adopted that new name and new kind of church structure. Now, the next group to pop up is another Pentecostal group, and again, I'm not sure if we should consider them Lutheran, because like they have Lutheran roots and they more see themselves a bit non-denominational, but unlike the Living Waters group in Mildura that kind of basically see themselves as non-denominational, this group do still see themselves as Lutheran in theology, and this is Edgar Mayer's group in Toowoomba, the Living Grace congregation in Toowoomba, and whatever other groups are associated with him now. So this all started with Edgar Mayer, a pastor in the LCA, who started this Lutheran renewal, NAR, New Apostolic Renewal thing within the Lutheran Church of Australia. And basically, there was a lot of backlash from that. There was a lot of support for that from a bunch of people in the LCA, but also a lot of backlash. And I don't know all the details, but basically, to keep the peace, Edgar Mayer had a peaceful dismissal from the LCA in 2017. Him and his congregation just left and went and did their own thing. To this day, they still actually have relations kind of with the LCA, not officially, but they do have support from certain pastors in the LCA, and they hold conferences and get like LCA pastors, have a bit of interaction with them. So while they're not officially in fellowship with the LCA, there is some kind of a unofficial work going on between some pastors of the LCA and Edgar Mayer's group. Next, we come to 2018 and 2019, and that is the formation of my synod, the coelc. Woo! We're finally here. So, myself, and I'm not going to go into all the history, especially since we're already at half an hour or nearly at half an hour with this video. I was born and raised in the Lutheran Church of Australia. I went and studied at the Lutheran Church of Australia's seminary, the Australian Lutheran College, but I really had an issue with women serving in the church, particularly lay women, and that came to a head, and long story short, the LCA wouldn't let me go on my vicarage, and therefore they wouldn't let me be ordained. They were happy to let me stay as a member of the LCA, and even happy to let me keep doing my studies as a lay theologian. Instead, I thought it was better to part ways with the LCA, and I went and reached out and joined the AELC, and I served with them as a vicar for about 12 months before we had a parting of ways over the issue of lay distribution. Again, not wanting to go into all the details and keep this video short, I'm just going to say we had a parting of ways. Again, both sides are going to try and make the other side seem like a villain, so I don't want to just blame it all on them, and hopefully they wouldn't blame it all on me. We basically didn't want to work together, and so I left. My wife and that were then at that point in time kind of members just of nothing, and I looked around at a bunch of different churches. I even at one point was looking at maybe joining up with Pastor Harris down in Melbourne. But instead, I ended up reaching out to a group called the OLCC, the Orthodox Lutheran Confessional Conference. Now, to give a brief history of them, as I said earlier when talking about the ELCR, there was this group called the LCR in America that had split from Missouri back in like the early 1900s, and in the early 2000s, I believe 2006, a bunch of congregations split from them and formed this new group, the OLCC. And there was a pastor in Denmark, my fellow brother pastor, Pastor Magnus Sørensen. He had originally been a member of the State Church in Denmark. He had then joined the Free Church of Denmark and had studied with them. Then there was a pastor that had got kicked out of the Free Church of Denmark, and Pastor Sørensen had originally followed him out, and they were in fellowship for a bit until they had a parting of ways. Interestingly, that other Danish pastor, he's now in fellowship with Pastor Troy Harris in Australia, and also the Swedish churches that Pastor Harris is in fellowship with. As for Pastor Magnus, he after that went off and joined the OLCC himself. So Pastor Magnus was a part of the OLCC. I had reached out to the OLCC and had actually begun the colloquy process. And we were in dialogue, and there was plans to have me join them, be ordained as their Australian Lutheran pastor. But then they had a big fight over the issue of objective justification. Again, we can discuss this in future videos. Don't need to go into all of the theological points in this video. But basically, they didn't actually kick Pastor Magnus out. There was another pastor, Pastor James Schrader, who was a member of the OLCC. He did get kicked out. Pastor Magnus willingly walked out. And I said, I actually side with those pastors, not with the OLCC. So I went off with those two pastors. Us three pastors then, Pastor Sørensen, Pastor Schrader, and myself, we formed what would then become the coelc, the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. There was a parting of ways with Pastor Schrader over church fellowship issues. And so instead, Pastor Sørensen and myself, we went on to form the coelc in September 2019. However, we are still not the last synod to be formed here in Australia. Following on from that, in the year 2021, we actually get two groups pop up. There is a family over in Western Australia who joined up with the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America. And I think they got joined by some other people as well. They were the Aldona congregation in Australia. Since then, the Aldona Philippines pastor, Pastor Fillmore Alvarez, he looks after the Australians, the Philippines. I think he's got a congregation in Singapore and elsewhere. The Southeast Asian congregations that were affiliated with Aldona officially then formed their own kind of diocese, CASIA. The Church of the Augustana Southeast Asia is what I believe it stands for. So they are essentially Aldona in Southeast Asia. So they are essentially Aldona in Australia for those who know Aldona. So if you don't know who CASIA is, it's just the Asian Aldona. So that also covers Australia. So that is the Aldona CASIA congregation here in Australia. Also in that year, Pastor Stephen Vanderhawk, who was a member of the Lutheran Church of Australia, also decided to leave and form his own congregation, and that's the St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Congregation in Adelaide. It is at this point in time still an independent congregation, not in fellowship with any particular synod, but he does have members both in Adelaide and also Melbourne. Maybe elsewhere in Australia, I'm not sure, but at least in Adelaide and Melbourne. So I think they're only one congregation, but they have two different locations. So basically kind of two congregations. And that brings us up then now to the final synod to be formed here in Australia, and that is the more recent Lutheran Mission Australia. So back in 2024, the LCA finally brings in women's ordination. Well, finally, the details of this are very kind of complicated, but again, kind of in a previous synodical meeting, the LCA kind of like made it possible for women's ordination to come in, and in 2024, they now made it possible for women's ordination to come in with them removing the statement from the Theses of Agreement that said women can't be pastors. However, the first ordination of women is only taking place now in April 2025. But basically, following this decision, there was this group of lay people and pastors that had formed this, at this point, kind of I've heard people use the term shadow synod before. It was the Lutheran Mission Australia. So at this point, it wasn't yet like a separate synod. It was kind of like a group within the LCA. I've heard people use the term shadow synod when they refer to these type of groups in like happening in Missouri Synod. Basically, it's like a group that is going to form a new synod but hadn't yet. And this Lutheran Mission Australia, LMA for short, gets formed. And then in like 2024, those people do break off from the LCA, but the actual kind of official launch of the LMA as an official synod doesn't take place until 2025. Again, the whole history of a lot of these things are complicated. This is one thing of studying history. Things are complicated. And there's also when you don't have all the information, and also when there's a bunch of counter information flying around, and one side says this and one side says that, and one side blames that group and one side blames that group, and this group says that group is evil and this group says that group's actually the evil ones. Trying to pinpoint things down is really hard. And when you take all that historical information and you're trying to break it down into as small a video as possible, you can't go into all the details. So for all those people watching, if I've skipped over something, if I've missed something important, I've done that probably because I'm trying to keep this short. I'm not trying to go into a deep history. I'm not trying to go into all the theological, important points and all the theological nuances. I'm saving those for the future videos. This video was meant to be a quick historical video on all the different Lutheran synods in Australia. I just wanted to give you an introduction as to who these synods were, how many synods there are, and where they all came from. And I was trying to keep it short, but it's already like nearly 40 minutes. So I'm going to wrap up this video quickly here. If you would like me to go into anything more nuanced into the history of these synods, just contact me, ask me, and I can bring it up in a future video. Instead, what I'm going to focus on now is in future videos, we're going to go through the theological differences. So this is going to be part of my synodical difference series where I go through what are the differences between this synod and that synod. Historically, I've only really looked at what is the difference between groups like the coelc and Eldona and the coelc and Missouri Synod. But in this series, I'm going to go through what is the differences between all the different synods in Australia. So not just how is the coelc different to the other Australian Lutheran synods, that of course is going to get covered in this series, but also how is the AELC different to the ELCR? How is the LCA different to the ELSA? We're going to cover all of that in this series, so please, if you've enjoyed this video, do all the like, subscribe, get notifications, all that kind of stuff, so you can stay tuned for the future videos in this series. We're going to look at things like church fellowship, communion, head coverings, lay ministry. All that's going to get covered in future videos. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless.